Our speaker for the Friday morning lecture series is Adam Jasienski. He's the Assistant Professor of Art History and Meadows School of the Arts here at SMU. Professor Jasienski received his PhD from Harvard University, specializing in 16th and 17th century visual culture with a focus on Spain and Latin America. He has received fellowships from the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, John Carter Brown Library, Casa de Velázquez, and Villa Itati. His research examines the tensions that arose at the intersection of portraiture and religious imagery, and of orthodox and popular forms of making and engaging with visual culture. Professor Jasienski is currently working on a book manuscript provisionally entitled Sanctity and Portraiture in the Early Modern Hispanic World, which draws on a number of inquisitorial trials about images from Spain and colonial Mexico and Guatemala. We are pleased to have him return to speak as part of the Luis Martin Lecture Series in the Humanities, following his popular series of lectures last spring focused on Giuseppe de Ribera. For this fall's program, Poetry and Paint, The World and Work of Francisco de Zurbaran, Professor Jasienski will lead us from Seville to the New World and back as we contextualize our current exhibition, Zurbaran, Jacob and His 12 Sons, and our upcoming installation, Murillo at the Meadows, a 400th anniversary celebration. So please join me in welcoming Adam Jasienski.
Thank you, Scott. And is the sound all right? Can everyone hear me? Let me echo Scott in apologizing for the mix-up. All I can say is I wish I had been this popular in high school. And let me thank also Scott and Mark Raglan and everyone else at the Meadows Museum for inviting me to once again do the lecture series. I'm going to find a spot where I can't hear myself quite so loudly. Let's see. This is all right for me. How is this for you? This is all right. This way I can also see my slides, which is a bonus. But I can't walk around quite as much, so I hope you forgive me. As Scott mentioned, I've titled this lecture series Poetry and Paint, The World and Work of Francisco de Zurbaran. But before I start, I'm curious, as Scott mentioned also, I gave 4 lectures in relation to the Ribera show, and I'm curious how many people heard those lectures. Quite a few, all right. So we have many repeat customers, which I'm very, very thankful for. I have decided to approach this, like the Ribera series, very broadly. So I hope you forgive me that we'll barely even hear about Zurbaran today. Maybe even next week we won't hear much about him. But the way I've decided to structure the lectures across the 6 weeks is in an arc of increasingly narrowing focus. Starting with today's lecture, the Hispanic World circa 1600, with the question, what is the world like in the moment in which Francisco de Zurbaran is born? What is the world in which he comes into artistic maturity? The next lecture will be about Spain and the Americas. As you know, there are some interesting transatlantic connections potentially brought up by our series of paintings upstairs. And I'll be exploring the background of those in the second lecture next week. The third week, again narrowing the focus, will be about Seville, the city that allowed him to become the master that he was, that in some ways trained him and gave him his greatest artistic opportunities, and it'll be about Seville in the 16th and 17th centuries. So again, quite a broad lecture looking at the history of that artistic center across 2 centuries. On October 20th, the lecture will be about Zurbaran and the sacred portrait. As Scott mentioned, this is a particular interest of mine, so I'll be shedding light on a little bit of my own research that I'm currently doing for my book, where a figure like Zurbaran figures quite prominently. On October 27th, civilians at the court of Madrid. We know that Zurbaran goes to Madrid on various occasions, and it's a great pretext to also talk about the other figures who had an impact on the artistic culture of that other great center for artistic production that was the court. And we'll mention Francisco Pacheco, we'll mention Velázquez, we'll mention all of these other figures that were in the ambit of our main protagonist. And finally, because in December, the Meadows Museum is celebrating the 400th anniversary of the birth of Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, we'll conclude with a lecture about Zurbaran and Murillo, contrasting and comparing these two titans of Spanish Golden Age painting. But as promised, today's lecture, the Hispanic World circa 1600. I've decided to divide this lecture into two main sections. That's not much. The first one, certainly much shorter than the second one. And again, with apologies, there won't be much talk about Zurbaran, so if you feel like storming out, you said, I came to hear about Zurbaran, not about all of this other stuff, I won't be offended. But the first topic that I'd like to approach, I've titled The Long Repercussions of 1492. Paradoxically, I think, to really understand what's happening in 1600, you have to look to 1492. It's an interesting historical coincidence that 4 fundamental events for understanding Golden Age Spanish culture occur in that same year. I'd argue even 4 of the most important events, and I'll briefly, very briefly, be going through all 4 of those. And the second section I've titled The World Within a Painting. We'll be traveling to present-day Ecuador, looking at one particular painting that, to me, emblematizes many of the concerns and issues that arise when looking at the career of a Golden Age artist working within the transatlantic Hispanic world. But to begin with 1492, what are these 4 events that happen? The first event that I'd like to briefly discuss is the fall of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada to the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. This is, of course, a photograph of the so-called Courtyard of the Lions, one of the most spectacular settings within this enormous palatial complex that's spread over a hill. I'm sure many of you have visited Granada. And what we see in this moment, in fact, what we see throughout the period of the very volatile political and religious hostilities that have, at this moment, characterized the Iberian Peninsula for centuries, we see a true kind of appropriation, but also replacement of what had come before. So here we have an aerial view of the Alhambra in Granada, where we see this structure here in the middle, a kind of perfect Renaissance palace, a circle inside of a square that is built by Pedro Machuca for Emperor Charles V in the middle of the enormous Nasrid palatial complex. We have precedents for this, of course. As you'll know, Spain's Islamic and Christian kingdoms have been basically at each other's throats since the 8th century. And in that very complex and long-lasting process, we of course also have fascinating moments of cultural and artistic conversation happening. Some scholars called this convivencia, literally coexistence or living together, to describe precisely this moment of cultural richness, cultural ferment that existed in the Iberian Peninsula at the intersection of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish cultures and those 3 religions. Other scholars criticized this notion, saying convivencia sounds wonderful, but in fact it glosses over the painful histories of the pogroms, of the interconfessional hostilities that actually were much more characteristic of the process. And I suggest that we think about this process somewhere in the middle. We have wonderful moments of cultural cooperation, wonderful art forms arising that truly speak to this sort of hybridity between these different cultures, but we also, of course, see the opposite happening. This is, as many of you will also recognize, the great Mosque of Cordoba, where I'd like to highlight that when the city falls to the Christian invaders from the north, a cathedral is built in the middle of the enormous mosque. And you can recognize some of the forms characteristic of Christian architecture, the buttresses, the octagonal dome, the basilica format with these windows above the level of the roof of the mosque. I'm showing you here now something much, much earlier. we're stepping back a couple of centuries from 1492 into the 10th century, the years 970, and in a monastery in northern Spain, in one of these particularly volatile areas which are very much undecided territorially, whether they belong to the Islamic kingdoms or the Christian kingdoms, we have a monastery where this manuscript is illuminated, the so-called Tabara Beatus. And we have this interesting illustration that speaks precisely to some of these issues I'm trying to get at in this moment, right? So to give you a bit of an understanding of what precedes 1492, we have an image of a monastery where we have this wonderful vignette of two monks sitting in a scriptorium working on the very type of manuscript that we can see on the screen in front of us. And there's a wonderful little figure here, very vigorously pulling on two ropes, up and down, up and down. And if we look up what those ropes lead to, he's in fact the bell ringer. He's pulling on the bells. Now, an image like this might not seem to be a politically charged image or an image about religious conflict until we realize that, excuse me, in the otherwise very tolerant Islamic kingdom to which this town of Tabara had belonged, there was one activity that was prohibited to the Christians, that was ringing of bells for Mass. And all of a sudden we see that even an image like this is charged with those echoes of interconfessional hostility that characterized much of the Iberian Peninsula in the centuries preceding 1492. At the same time, for a scholar who would be interested instead in looking at examples of convivencia, we would be struck to notice that we have these forms of horseshoe arches in this building, which is after all a monastery, much more characteristic of Islamic architecture, we would think, but in fact, something that would be quite natural to a person living in this period. And we have those time and again appearing again in Christian contexts, speaking precisely to this rich collaboration between cultures, borrowings between cultures that we observe in this period. And I'll just show you this last page. As you can see, I love this manuscript, where you can see that a manuscript painter from a northern kingdom in Spain is clearly in conversation visually with the famous bicolored arches from the mosque in Cordoba. The second event that I'd like to briefly talk about that occurred in 1492 is the expulsion of Spain's Jewish population. Same year, this is what happens. I'd like to stress that this is not unique to Spain. Such an occurrence had happened in England 100 years prior. We see it occurring in Germany and in France. So Spain is in some ways not unique in this regard. However, it's important because, of course, the Jewish population of Spain participated equally vigorously in this type of cross-cultural exchange that we observe that characterizes this earlier period. Here, surprisingly, perhaps to us, and yet probably totally unsurprisingly to a person living in 14th century Cordoba, we have an example of Kufic calligraphy in Arabic in the decoration of a mosque. Now, the reason this probably wouldn't be surprising to an individual living in Cordoba in the 14th century is because both Islam and Judaism are monotheistic religions. The sentiment expressed here is that there's only one God, and therefore something that to a Jewish practitioner in the synagogue would have been an absolutely allowable message. But what I'm trying to get at, again, is that we have a moment of cross-cultural and cross-religious ferment happening, and then 1492 marks a moment that will chart out how the 16th and 17th centuries will approach other religions. We see an increase in policing of religion. We see a increased presence of the Inquisition in precisely trying to control how people are engaging in the practice of their spirituality. The third event, of course, is probably the most famous. And in fact, it's the pretext for my entire next lecture, the relationship between Spain and the Americas, but it's of course Christopher Columbus's first voyage and his reaching of the Caribbean. Here we see what's perhaps the very first European-made map of the Americas. And you can see how wonderfully spontaneous this is. We can imagine Columbus sitting on his ship and adding little brushstrokes to this line of coast as the ship sails along it. We can just make out where he is. This is the northwestern tip of the island of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And even with paintings like this, as iconic as Velázquez's Spinners, I often like to ask my students, can we imagine that such a painting is even possible without Spain's intensive and extractive investment in the American colonies? From something as basic as the finances that allowed for Spain to become such a global superpower, to something as prosaic as the color red, which we see throughout this painting, which is harvested in Mexico. Here's a representation of the gathering of cochineal beetles, which some scholars argue have fundamentally transformed the capabilities of painting in this period. And it was, in fact, one of Mexico's greatest exports. And finally, the fourth event that happens in 1492 is the publication of Antonio de Nebrija's Gramatica. Nebrija was a grammarian, and he was interested in charting out the rules that stood behind the Spanish language. Here's the frontispiece of this publication. And famously, Nebrija declared to his patron, Queen Isabel the Catholic, language was always the companion of empire. Strong words. This very much, of course, is related to the previous point about the conquest of the Americas. But what's extraordinary to me about Spain is that in some ways it's truly the first bureaucratic empire. They realized the power of the word, they realized the power and importance of paper, and what we see here in this period is the foundation of numerous archives, the creation of multiple copies of every document that's being produced, the rise of a powerful notarial class. All of these things, of course, are not new, but Spain marshals the possibilities of the written word to a never-seen-before extent. And another thing that the publication of the grammar does, and soon after a publication of the dictionary between Spanish and Latin, does two things. I'm sure many of you have encountered texts in Spanish from the 16th and 17th centuries, and what we're lucky is that with a Spanish that we learn today, we are very often able to easily read those in comparison with, say, our friends who are trying to read even something like Shakespeare. If we think about our friends who are working on 15th or 16th century Italy or 15th or 16th century France, those languages have evolved in some ways much, much more. Spanish is codified very early on precisely through the publication of these sorts of metatexts, that is to say, texts about language. And therefore, in some ways, to our benefit, we have this kind of extraordinary corpus that's performing this type of task with language. So to me, these are the four main events that really chart out what will be important in the 16th and 17th centuries: religion, conquest, and territorial expansion, and language. And I think we'll see these three themes rearing their head time and again throughout the lectures as we'll be discussing them. Arguably, they are all essential to understanding not only a figure like Zurbaran, but in general, I would say, the visual culture and the socioculture of the broader Hispanic world in the period that interests us. I move now to my second point, the world within a painting. And again, you'll see that some of the issues that interest me, these main points, will also appear here. And I've chosen this painting because, well, it's really quite extraordinary. We moved to the city of Quito, present-day capital of Ecuador, in the year 1599. And this is the painting in question. I'm curious, have Has anyone seen this painting before? A few heads, but I'd be curious to get a show of hands. A few people. And that's actually quite interesting to me as well, and I'll explain towards the end of the lecture why that is. This is a portrait of Don Francisco de Arrobe and his two sons, painted by the painter Andrés Sánchez Galka in the year 1599, and it belongs to the Museo de América, the Museum of the Americas in Madrid. The portrait is extraordinary in many ways. Historically, it's quite rare to have a painting of a person of African descent in this period presented so prominently, not as a secondary figure to a white protagonist. The painting is also extraordinary because it's very well documented. As an art historian, I love text, because text, if there's the archival document that can shed light on a work of art, it tells us so much more about that work of art's story. Oftentimes, it can tell us about that work of art's afterlife. It can shed a lot of light on why a work of art was made and where it went afterwards. And this portrait is alternatively known as the portrait of the three gentlemen of Esmeraldas. Esmeraldas is a region in present-day Ecuador on the coast, showing you here. So here we have Mexico City, and then we move down and into South America, and here is Ecuador with Esmeraldas just here. So here we have the capital of Quito in the Andean highlands, and we move down towards the coast where we have Esmeraldas. And you wouldn't be wrong to think that there's not much here. You'd be right. Just as in the 16th century, this was a basically impenetrable mountainous jungle with multiple swamps that led into the kind of mangrove marshes of the coast of Ecuador. At the same time, as the name suggests, a very wealthy region. Esmeraldas means emeralds. This was an important region for mining. Also a very perilous coast, an important one because many ships that were traveling towards the great port of Callao that belonged to the city of Lima, of course, had to pass this way. But a perilous coast because there are many underwater rocks that are invisible to ships. I'm giving you all of this background because the father of this central figure, Francisco de Arrobe, was a slave. He was on a ship bound for Lima when the ship ran aground off of the coast of Esmeraldas. A large group of slaves managed to escape inland and throughout years established a thriving community there, intermarrying with the local population. So in the period documents, Don Francisco is referred to as a mulatto, a son of a person of African descent and an indigenous person from Ecuador. His son, Francisco de Arrobe, arrives in the city in Quito in 1578 at the invitation of the king in order to be baptized, in order to be brought into the Christian fold. And he agrees to do this for various privileges, including becoming governor of the region of Esmeraldas. This region is a big problem for Spain. It's strategic and wealthy for all of the reasons I described, and they're also very concerned that British or Dutch pirates could get a foothold in South America, that then the Spanish would have an enormous problem in reaching from the inland, precisely because of these questions of landscape and geography that make it so impenetrable to get there from the inland. And so Francisco de Arrobe is baptized, and his sons eventually are also baptized. And in 1599, he's invited back to Quito, and this portrait is painted by him at the instances of Juan del Barrio y Sepúlveda, a local bureaucrat who is very much trying to elevate his position in the Spanish monarchy. And he's trying to use his idea of giving Don Francisco de Arrobe the governorship as a way to show the king his own strategic acumen. And he writes a letter to the king which accompanies the portrait as it travels overseas. And here's what he says. I've given you the Spanish here. He says, also, I myself, making sure that the king knows who the portrait is from, send to your Royal Highness the portraits of Captain Don Francisco de Arrobe and Don Pedro and Don Domingo, his sons. Principals, mulatto principals of the province of Esmeraldas, with a short description of this event, as it seems to me that your Highness would like to see such a new and extraordinary thing, and to see these barbarians who have up till now been invincible. So he's using a language of exoticism. He's creating a sense that these people are different from him, and making sure that the monarch can then perceive them in the portrait. But the portrait is extraordinary because we can see that the sitters are actually marshaling a wide range of references in order to present themselves as global citizens, in some ways much more global than the person who's paying for the portrait, Juan del Barrio y Sepúlveda, because they can reference multiple symbolic vocabularies, as we'll see. What is very striking in this portrait, to those of you who've seen it in person, is the gold paint used to give a glint to these various ornamental pieces of jewelry that these individuals are wearing. And there's a long tradition of these types of hammered gold artifacts in this region of coastal Ecuador and Colombia. And I'm showing you a number of these pieces here, as well as a pre-Columbian figurine, much, much older, where we have an individual wearing such types of piercings ornamentally, and showing you what these types of pieces looked like that this individual, Don Domingo, is wearing, to give a sense that there was a kind of precedent and a tradition in this region for this type of ornamentation. You can also tell that these three individuals are wearing a local type of undergarment, a tunic known in the Andean highlands as an uncu, and we can tell that because of the kind of V-neck quality. These tunics, which are very prestigious objects, are large rectangular flat weaves with only one opening in the middle, and then they're bound on the sides. And you can see that this tunic has arranged around his neck in this way. So he's wearing a local style of jewelry and a local garment. We can see how these garments would have looked in these illustrations from the great Peruvian chronicle by Huaman Poma de Ayala from just a few years later. At the same time, I'm struck by the wealth of the fabrics. In some ways, it reminds me of the paintings upstairs. I think you would probably agree. And so if we look at just a few of these examples and compare them with our paintings by Zurbaran, you can see a kind of similar interest in rich, multi-hued, varied fabrics. We know that these aren't being produced locally in Ecuador. They're probably coming from various places. They could be coming from as far as China. They could be coming from the Ottoman Empire, which we know was producing silks for the Western European market. They could be coming from Italy. So we have already, purely in the fabrics from which these garments are made, a kind of global conversation happening. We have something as interesting as the format of the portrait. Here's a slightly earlier portrait attributed to Alonso Sanchez Coello, and isn't it striking how similar the arrangement of the figures, the styling, the pose, the way they carry themselves in these images is? It's very, very clear, I think, to anyone who sees the portrait of Don Francisco de Arrobe in this period that they're dealing with a royal figure, right? Someone who's been brought into the Spanish fold and agreed to serve as a governor, but nevertheless has very much the status of a royal figure. And in addition, of course, there are stylistically European elements of dress. Of course, the golilla, the collar, as well as the ruff around the sleeve, the silk of the undershirt, all of these are yet another layer of cultural complexity that's embedded within this portrait. And what's maybe most extraordinary is the cartouche and the signature beneath it. So this is the cartouche that's in the corner, which gives an additional layer of the story's history. And it's based, of course, on any number of prints that were circulating throughout the Spanish Americas with these sorts of ornamental decorations that were precisely served to be copied for various sorts of other compositions. And so the text reads, Dr. Juan del Barrio de Sepúlveda, auditor of His Majesty's Chancellery of Quito, at his own expense, had this made in the year 1599 for Philip III, Catholic King of Spain and the Indies. Once more, Sepúlveda is stressing that he made this, that this was his responsibility and he's done it well, making sure that there's no confusion when this painting gets to Madrid, that the paper doesn't get disassociated from the object. No confusion here. Who's in charge? And that, of course, has to make us wonder to what extent were the sitters of the portrait, Don Francisco and his two sons, involved in the way that they were presented. We can never really tell with portraits, but we know that in many other cases, the sitter has a lot of agency over how they're presented, over what they choose to wear for a portrait. In this case, of course, it's hard to tell, especially because Sepúlveda is so vigorously claiming his own agency over this image. So that's something that we'll never truly know. But we can think that Don Francisco de Orobe has quite a large impact in the painting, even to the fact of choosing to be depicted in this wide range of objects, from the local jewelry and tunic to the imported textiles to the Spanish-style ruff. And beneath the cartouche, right here, is the signature. A bit hard to make out, perhaps, so I've transcribed it for you. And then if we spread it out, it reads Andres Sanchez Galka, natural de Quito, fake it. Andres Sanchez Galka, native of the city of Quito, made this. And this is more important than it may seem, because Andres Sanchez Galka is not a Spanish painter. He's an indigenous painter from the city of Quito. He's trained in a Franciscan workshop in that city, but he is born in the Andean highlands. So we have an extraordinary object in which not only are a wide array of global objects represented and brought together, but we have an indigenous American painter painting a sitter who is of African descent for a Spanish patron in order to be shipped to Europe, a truly global object. And we can see all of these things being brought together in this one image. And so, what is the painting's afterlife, and why does that matter? Well, as I mentioned, there's a great paper trail for this image. We know a lot about what happened to it later on. Here's a map of Madrid from the 1650s, and we know that in 1636, the painting was in a very specific place. Sadly, we don't know what happened to it right when it arrived. We have no account of what the king thought about it, for instance. Wouldn't that be great? Unfortunately, the first note of it comes 30 years after its arrival. And it's here. This is the royal palace, the Alcázar, the monastery of the Encarnación, one of the royal monasteries in Madrid. And we know that it's in a room called the Pieza Angosta sobre el Panadero, the narrow room above the bakery, which luckily we know exactly where that is. It's here in this strange elevated walkway that connects the royal palace to the royal monastery. Heaven forbid anyone have to step on this street. And this type of walkway has a precedent in Europe in this period, a precedent that survives, because unfortunately this walkway and this palace don't survive. The precedent that survives is in Florence, the so-called Corridoio Vasariano, the Vasari Corridor. And you can see it here. If you've ever walked on the Ponte Vecchio, you might not even have noticed that there's a row of windows here which connect and then lead on and here, snaking towards the Palazzo Vecchio from the Palazzo Pitti in the Oltrarno district. It's a corridor filled with paintings, and it was precisely had this purpose, that allowing the Medici dukes to pass between their two major properties on two banks of the river unnoticed, unseen from below. also a great way to get out of a bind if one of the palaces is in trouble. So let's imagine that we are in this narrow room over the bakery, because we know that that's where our painting hung, and we know what else was there with it. So let's imagine it's hanging here. We know that it's also in the same space are two mythological scenes, a representation of Diana and her nymphs, and a triumph of Bacchus. I've chosen these at random, but these are pictures that were in Spain. We know that there was a battle scene. We don't know what the subject of the battle was, but it very well may have been the great battle of Lepanto, won just a few decades prior. And we know there are portraits, including of Henry II of France, and also of one of the Habsburg cousins, Emperor Ferdinand in Austria. So it wouldn't have been strange to a passerby that this painting would be included within this gallery. This painting, this extraordinary well-documented painting from the Americas, that it would be hanging among these other types of very European images, mythological paintings, battle scenes, and portraits of other royalty. I think we can even imagine that a painting by Zurbaran could comfortably exist in this space. This is one of his female saints. And I'll explain in a moment why I think it's important to stress the fact that this painting could exist in the same space as these other works, because in certain moments of its history, that wasn't so obvious. Before I do that, though, I'd like to take a quick look at this painting by Zurbaran at the Prado, thought to represent Saint Luke before the crucified Christ. You can see here the evangelist, who's the patron saint of painters, is holding his palette and looking up at what? A painting that he's just finished, perhaps a sculpture that he has painted, or perhaps he's truly in front of the crucified Christ in a vision. What's important for our purposes is that many people consider this to be a self-portrait of Zurbaran as the evangelist Saint Luke. And so could we imagine Zurbaran also passing through that hallway, looking up at the painting of the three gentlemen of Esmeraldas? I'd like to think yes. And I'd like to, therefore, always keep in mind that the golden age of Spanish painting is, in fact, a global moment. It's a moment in which it would have been deeply natural for people that objects and images from very disparate locales could comfortably coexist in the same space. And this might sometimes seem surprising to us. Oftentimes, scholars are surprised that there are these kind of global connections way before the era of globalization that is thought to characterize our own time. And why do I say this? Here's a postcard from the Anthropological Museum of Madrid, the Archaeological Museum of Madrid, from the mid-19th century. And you'll see where our painting has been removed to. From the royal collection, it's been moved into a room with various American antiquities, including a plaster cast of the so-called calendar stone. Now, in doing so, its status as art has been challenged. It's been simply recategorized as a sort of ethnographic curiosity. It's been removed from the conversations that it was allowed to have prior, fitting in the royal collection of paintings, with paintings like Zurbaran, with those mythological scenes, with portraits of other royalty, into a context in which it is marked as different. It's marked as being outside of that category and therefore not allowed to be a part of fine art. And this is important because when I asked you who had seen this painting, which belongs still to the Prado, and many of you I'm sure have been to the Prado, very few of you had seen it because it's still removed. It's in the Museo de Americas, a small museum on the outskirts of Madrid, and not enshrined along the other great masterpieces of European painting. And this, again, gives us, I think, a skewed perception of what the Golden Age was actually like. And so I ask that we take a picture like this on its own terms, but also keeping in mind that it was in conversation with many of the works that we'll be looking at during the remainder of this lecture series, and to keep in mind also that Zurbaran's pictures, which we know traveled, which we know many of which ended up in the Americas, were in the same kind of networks of circulation and exchange as the three gentlemen of Esmeraldas. Thank you.